I will now make a statement in my capacity as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. We would like to thank for their assessments and views Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, Special Representative of the OSCE, Chairperson in office in Ukraine in the Trilateral Contact Group, and the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Session, Mr. Chevik. And we are grateful to Ms. Tatiana Manchan for her valuable information firsthand about how the Security Council decisions on implementing intra-Ukrainian conflict are being implemented in practice. The date of the meeting today is not random. This is a day when 7 years ago the Security Council of the United Nations passed Resolution 2202, and it unanimously adopted the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement as the only international legal basis to settle the civil conflict in the east of Ukraine. And that is why the main goal for the meeting today we see in reaffirming by the Security Council of the fact that there is no alternative to this momentous for Ukraine document. Unfortunately, 7 years down the road, we are increasingly thinking that the implementation of the Minsk agreements is not something that's in the plans of our Ukrainian neighbors. They're stating that openly now. Let me give you some examples. As recently as yesterday, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk, stated that there will be no new laws on the special status of Donbass, so no direct agreements. And this took place after Zelensky had a meeting with Chancellor Scholz. She also acknowledged that there is no pressure exerted by West on them to implement the Minsk agreements. On the 4th of February, there was an interview by the Ukrainian channel 1+1 by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kuleba. He said that the Minsk agreement cannot be implemented on Russian terms, and in those terms he thinks there's a direct dialogue between Ukraine and Donbass, despite the fact that this is clearly stated in the package of measures. This same idea was expressed by the head of Ukrainian presidential administration, Yermak, at the recent meeting in Normandy. Earlier, on the 2nd of February, Mr. Kuleba said that no Ukrainian region will have a veto right on the state decision. This is cast in stone, so there will be no special status, as Russia says, no veto. One day earlier, on the 1st of February, Zelensky also recalled for the world entire of Ukraine's inability to negotiate. He hinted at an alternative solution to the conflict in Donbass and says that Kiev has a different view to the order of the implementing the provisions of the Minsk agreement. On the 31st of January, in the interview to the Associated Press, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council stated that the implementation of the Minsk agreement means destroying of the country. They were assigned at the barrel of Russian guns, and Germans and the French looked on, and every rational person understood that the implementation is impossible. Ukrainian politics are trying to implant the opinion in the West that the Minsk agreements are against the national interest of Ukraine. But if the goal of building peace on their own land is part of the national interest of Ukraine, well, such statements are out of place. Another excuse that we hear here is that Russia is not implementing some of its obligations in the Minsk agreements. And it is very possible that this is something that we'll also hear today. At the same time, it's obvious that there are absolutely no grounds for that because there is no mention of Russia in the text of the Minsk agreements. Let me just give you one opinion on this, not by anyone, but by a judge from the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. He very recently proposed opening criminal prosecution against those who participated in the working out of Minsk agreements, Leonid Kuchma and Petro Poroshenko. And the reason, he says, and I quote, Minsk provides for 20 obligations placed on Ukraine, 6 on OSCE, 2 on Donbass, and not a single one for Russia. End of quote. Colleagues, please allow me to, yet once again, very briefly, recall the contents of the document we're discussing at this meeting of ours. Let me list it item by item, and the order in which they are to be implemented is very clearly stated. It cannot be changed. First, ceasefire. Second, withdrawal of weapons. 3, OSCE monitoring. 4, launching a dialogue between Kiev and Donbass. 5, amnesty. 6, exchange of detainees. 7, humanitarian access. 8, lifting the economic blockade. 9, transfer to the Kiev border control provided item 11 is implemented. 10, withdrawal of foreign formations and mercenaries. 11, new constitutions providing special status for Donbass. 12, agreeing on the order of conducting elections. And 13, intensifying the work of the contact group in Minsk. 7 years down the road, it is clear that none of the provisions of the package of measures have been implemented by Ukraine in full. Starting with the first one, ceasefire. And the root of the problem here is systematic lack of desire of Kiev to get into a direct dialogue with the authorized representative of Donetsk and Luhansk in the contact group. Whereas this is a dialogue that is clearly directly provided in items 4, 9, 11, and 12 of the document. This is not our requirement. This is something that is stated in the document. It's an obligation on Ukraine. And this is something that our neighbors increasingly bring into question and thus risk undermine the whole Minsk process, which could lead to devastating consequences for Ukraine. Ukraine stubbornly refuses to implement the provisions of the Minsk on direct dialogue with Donbass, interim self-governance, restoring socioeconomic links, constitutional reform. And currently, the Verkhovная Rada has a draft on decentralization. It's not agreed with Donbass, and it does not provide for a special status. Ukrainian side has taken course to completely move away from a direct interaction with Donbass within the coordination mechanism, and they are providing various options, but they do not allow for effective reaction in case there are violations. Attempts to place the blame on Russia are futile and baseless, and this only hides the goal of shifting the blame away from Ukraine. I must say that we are very disappointed by the ostrich-like position of our Western colleagues who are trying not to see obvious things. We are surprised that they're putting into the shadow the Minsk complex of measures, but they are placing the emphasis on the Normand format. I'd like to recall the Normand format, according to Annex 2 of the resolution, is a mechanism to control implementation, but not a place where new decisions could be discussed. For 7 years, Russia has been calling in all platforms for the Western sponsors to exert pressure on Kiev to implement the Minsk agreements. They were doing exactly the opposite. So the increasing feeling of impunity pushed the Ukrainian hotheads to new excuses and military adventures against their own people. And this is what we have. We have thousands of victims of the internal armed conflict. Many millions in Donbass are still presented as foreigners in their own country. They have automatic rifles, sniper rifles, howitzers, and strike drones targeted at them. Ukrainian representatives keep coming up with new excuses not to implement their agreements and order to shell their own people. There is an Alley of Angels, a memorial complex in Donetsk to commemorate the children who died at the hands of Ukrainian military. Those who died at the children's beach in Zurgus on the 13th of August. It was targeted by the Air Force of Ukraine. 20 people died, dozens were wounded. A 24-year-old Anastasia Rubin, a local, was there with her son at the time when the Ukrainian Air Force started shelling the town from their multiple rocket launch system. One of the charges exploded right next to them. Everything was covered in blood and smoke and bloodied bodies of children. This and other similar episodes were compiled by the Investigative Committee of Russia and the RT Media in a compilation showing the Ukrainian military using prohibited means or ways of means. And our UN mission have compiled that and disseminated this to members of the Security Council. Please take a look at them. You will be horrified by them. The Kiev's commitment to the complex of measures can also be illustrated by the abduction last year in Lugansk from the Joint Center on Coordination and Control of Andrea Cossack. Mr. Kinnunen, we would be very grateful if you could tell us about this episode. This is a treacherous event, and it is a direct violation of item 5 of the conflict measures, which prohibits the prosecution and punishment of persons in connection with the events in Donetsk and Luhansk. Colleagues, I would like to finally say that you will be able to resist the temptation to play to the cameras and will not make this meeting of ours into a circus, will not present here baseless accusations saying that Russia allegedly was going to attack Ukraine. I think we've had enough speculation on that, including the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January convened by the United States. We have long ago clarified everything and explained everything, and the announced date of the so-called invasion is behind us, so therefore my advice to you is not present yourself in an awkward situation. I thank you for your attention.